We're recording this so that if you have any colleagues that were unable to make the session today, you can go ahead and share it with them. We have the prior two sessions that contain the same content as this one today up on our website already. We'll be sending out a communication to everyone who registered for this webinar with access to those videos. It will end up being 3 videos by the time we post this one, so you can see the customized one that was for your session or any of the other ones that we have. The other reminder here is that there is a question box, and we've already tested it once here to make sure that it's working today. You can go ahead and type a question at any time, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation. And at certain other times, we'll be pausing for any questions along the way too, if you'd like to answer one or ask one verbally as well. If you are muted right now, either on your end or my end, and you would like to talk, you can also go ahead and ask in the question box or raise your hand. That's another button you can do in the fabulous world of webinar technologies, and I'll do my best to unmute you so you can ask a question that way as well. Today, what we'll be starting with after this slide of the topics today, we'll start with introductions from our team at Education Analytics, as well as I'll be letting you know that there's a couple folks from NWEA on the call. We will then move on to Education Analytics 3012C options. I see some familiar names in the list of attendees today, and just to get this out there right away, we will be continuing to provide 3012C compliant options for any district that would like to continue on with if you've applied for a hardship waiver and your district is going to be using the 3012C law in this upcoming summer. We will be able to provide you with the growth model options that our team has produced in the past. We'll be explaining those a little bit. Then we're going to go on to the next topic area of the 3012D options that have been recently approved by the state. We have 2 options. We have a growth model and a student learning objectives option. We'll be talking about the 2 of those. Then we'll move on to logistics for obtaining results. And then finally, we will probably have quite a bit of time for any questions and answers that haven't been addressed so far when in the bulk of the presentation. Start with introductions. So there are 2 organizations working together to provide options for using the MAP assessment in APPR plans. Education Analytics, that's our team. We are an organization creating state-approved growth models and student learning objective approaches for APPR using the MAP assessment. Any questions about the use of the MAP for APPR, specifics of the newly approved 3012D APPR approaches, or the approaches EA has used in select New York districts in the past for 3012C should be directed at EA. Northwest Evaluation Association, NWEA, they're the other organization on the call today. They created the MAP assessment and they're working with districts to implement MAP. Any questions related to the MAP assessment itself should be directed at NWEA. So today, representing EA are Sean McLaughlin, that's me, the Director of Operations and Communications. I also have another EA team member with me, Joe. He's worked a lot on the data itself and has done some of the preliminary analyses that we'll be looking at today. And I mean, just so they can hear your voice, you want to say hi, Joe? Hello. All right, that's Joe. So there's the 2 of us from Education Analytics. We also have 2 representatives from NWEA on the call today that I'm aware of. We have Amanda Towerman and Nate Jensen. So they're here if there's any questions that have to do with the MAP assessment itself. And our 2 teams are working together in New York for several years related to 3012C. Since not all MAP districts in New York have worked with EA before, we're going to start with some more background about who EA is. And I think I forgot to click a couple of times. So let's see, Sean McLaughlin, Joe, we're here today. Amanda is on the line, and Nate, I didn't put your name on there, but you're welcome. Thanks for joining us as well. So far, I see one question. Is there a link to the PowerPoint? We'll be sharing the slides out to everyone that registered for today. We'll have that available to you. We'll send a message out shortly, so we'll have those for you. So what is Education Analytics? We are a nonprofit organization. We're located in Madison, Wisconsin. We're led by Dr. Robert H. Meyer, and he wears a few different hats. One of which is the founder and president of our organization here at Education Analytics. He's also a research professor at UW-Madison and a professor at the La Follette School of Public Affairs. Over on the right side of the screen, we have a little screenshot of what our website looks like. And I don't think you can click on that there just because this is a webinar, but that's the web address to go look at our website. We'll be showing a few different pages about what we have up there that might be interesting information for you. And there'll also be a link there at the communication that I alluded to that we'll be sending out to anybody that registered for this webinar today. Here's a little look at some of the places that we've worked with to produce growth metrics in the past and in the present, some of which are related to growth metrics in the kind of the SGP, value added, those sort of things. We also have been working with a number of districts and states related to student learning objective work. So we have a mix of these different backgrounds, and this is just a sense of some of the places that we worked with before. Notably for this project, we've been working for a number of years in a bunch of districts in New York on 3012C related metrics, and then we have a separate line of work with New York City. So first of all, I'm going to be talking about the 3012C options and why am I doing that? So first of all, some, perhaps most of the 50 districts that we worked with in the past will continue to use 3012C measures. As we understand it, there's an option for districts to apply for hardship waivers and then continue to use the plans that they've worked with in the past. So for the districts that have used education analytics, or perhaps you've heard of us as VARC analytics, those metrics are going to continue to be provided, and we're going to talk about those today. For other cases, we also think that this is useful to talk about because it's background on our team's co-build approach to growth measures, to kind of give anybody that hasn't heard of us before a chance to look at how we've approached growth measures before. Also, it's background on our team's use of MAP data and SIRS data together. So there's two different main sources of data that we're using for the metrics that we've been providing, one of which is the MAP test data that we were able to obtain from NWEA as long as districts are signing consent forms. There's also a different version, different set of data called the SIRS data, that's Student Information Repository System. Those are data that your district already tend to provide to either BOCES or RICs that go to the state for other purposes. Those are data that we are also able to obtain if you're able to sign those consent forms. We use those for the metrics that we'll be providing as well. And finally, the approved growth measure for 3012D will be very similar to EA's 3012C approach that we've used in the past. So that's another reason to talk about 3012C. Some details of the 3012D approach implementation are still pending. So just as a preview, some of these decisions and procedures are defined already, some of which we're still waiting on some details and some kind of lines of kind of way that we'll be doing data collection to resolve themselves. Most notably, the timeline is still a detail that's pending. So we'll be continuing to provide those details as they emerge, but not everything is all settled yet. Some more background, how was EA's 3012C method determined? We co-developed that with an advisory council that includes representatives from participating New York districts, NYSED, NYSUT, and then our team, Education Analytics and NWEA, has been coming together over a number of years to produce the 3012C metrics and make the determinations of how those would work. Moving forward, NWEA and EA will continue to solicit feedback and direction from the Advisory Council and other New York districts, and will make adjustments to our current recommendations as needed. So far, we've really taken direction from the Advisory Council and our meetings in the past to develop how the 3012C and now 3012D metrics are built, but we're always trying to get more feedback about how we can make them even better. I'm going to continue to talk about 3012C and try to be really explicit about when we make the transition to 3012D and our explanation so far. So I still have the 3012C mindset happening right now for this section. There were two growth models that we have produced in the past and will be continuing to produce this upcoming year for those of you that need it. There's the value added measure, or the VA. That is a measure of the contribution of educators to student growth. It compares the growth of your students to similar students. And what do we mean by similar students? It takes into account a bunch of stuff, including things like English language learner status, special education status, free reduced price lunch status, a bunch of other student level data. Also the starting point of students, the test window, a bunch of different stuff. We all take that into account in the value added methodology. There's also a second methodology that we have produced in the past called the Conditional Growth Index, the CGI metric. What that does is it's an additional growth model for districts desiring two different ways to use MAP for 3012C. It aggregates NWEA's CGI metric, and we use the same rules to link students to teachers as we have used in value added. So it's a way to aggregate that up for districts that wanted two different ways to use MAP under 3012C. Today we'll be focusing mainly on the value added metric because that has the most similarities to the 3012D growth model approach. We'll also be talking about the student learning objective approach, which is kind of a new way of looking at MAP data. This is another area of our website that you'll have access to later once we give you a link. This is the part of the website that has to do with the project that we've used in the past. So it has a description of how our 3012C metrics work. It has some information about how Education Analytics uses SIRS data in the process. There's resources for different audiences, sample results files, and then a timeline of events of how this has worked in the past under 3012C. As I alluded to a little bit earlier, the details of the timeline for 3012D are still pending. We'll be sharing those details as we learn more about how this is going to work. Specifically, there are two introductory videos that you may find useful, particularly if you haven't worked with us in the past. It has that oak tree analogy. For anybody that's seen that before, you can breathe a sigh of relief because I'm not going to be going over that again today. Some of you have seen that several times. But anybody that hasn't seen that, it might be useful for you to view it. You can find that on our website there, along with some frequently asked questions. Those two videos have a lot of similarities to EA's upcoming 3012D approved growth model approach. It does not have information about the student learning objectives approach yet. That's still pending. What I'm going to be doing now is giving a brief overview for anybody, especially that hasn't worked with us before, but otherwise a refresher for those of you that have, about how the growth model, the value added model that we've produced in the past works. This should just be a few slides, only take a few minutes. So the first step is after spring testing is complete, EA collects student data from participating districts across the state and determines demographic and other adjustments. We want that because we want to produce an apples to apples comparison of how your students grew compared to similar students across the state. That's why we need to collect all that data. Then what we do is we produce a customized statistical prediction based on each student's characteristics. So we take the fall score for each student, and then we make various adjustments for those different factors that we collected at the end of the year to find out how did similar students, how did average students with similar characteristics grow during the same time period. A note here that the statistical prediction is not something that we're able to produce at the beginning of the year. We need to collect all those data at the end of the year and then use that to determine how similar students grow. So prediction is kind of a weird word to use, but it's prediction in the statistical sense. Then what we do is we determine if each student exceeded or did not meet that prediction and by how much. On the left side, we have a student, and I always think about this a little bit too late, but I'm not sure if you can see the mouse, but I'll try to do this. So we have a student on the left here with a certain score. They get a prediction that's customized for his or her characteristics as well as the starting point. Then we find out, did the actual score at the end of the year exceed or did not meet that prediction by how much? In this case, the student did better than typical for similar students by 5 points. This student exceeded their prediction by 5 points. On the right side, we have a different student, and they have a different customized prediction based on his or her characteristics and starting point. And we find out that this student did a little bit worse. They did not grow as fast as similar students in the state across the districts that we're participating with. It turns out this student did not meet prediction by 4 points. So we do that for every student in our sample. And then as a fourth step, we determine on average, did a teacher's students tend to exceed or not meet their predictions and by how much? That lets us know the value each teacher added to the student's growth. On the left side, we have an example of teacher A's classroom. We look, there's a lot of arrows going up. They're green arrows. That means that students were beating their predictions and in some cases by a wide margin. In this case, on average, students tended to beat their predictions by a little over 3 points, 3 RIT points. that means this teacher is going to have an above average value added. On the right side, we see a teacher whose students on average tended to not meet their predictions. And if we average that all up, it turns out his or her students tended to not meet their predictions by a little more than 1 point. This teacher would have a below average value added rating. So now, after we've determined that, our job is to translate that to 0 to 20 because APPR requires a 0 to 20 rating for APPR. What we do is use the default translation that was decided upon jointly by the New York Advisory Council. So we have a default translation for folks. This is just an example visually about how to think about it. On the left side, we have classrooms where students on average tended not meet their predictions by a wide margin. That would mean that this teacher would have a score pretty low in the 0 to 20 range. On the other end of the scale, Miss Smith here, we have students that ended up averaging quite a bit more growth than typical students after we've made all those adjustments. That would mean Miss Smith would have a number high in the 0 to 20 scale. And there's a whole range up and down here that lets us know how did your students tend to beat or not meet their predictions and by how much. That translation is a table, and I'll give you a little bit of an insight into that later about how that all gets translated. There's two sources of data we use to make all those determinations, one of which is the NWEA's MAP data. That is the fall and spring test scores for students, and that's also the source of CGI scores that we use to aggregate. One important note I want to let everyone know is that we do not use NWEA's class roster files to determine our students linked to certain teachers. The reasons, there's three different reasons, one of which is the class roster files were never designed for this purpose. It was not for accountability's sake of understanding which students were linked to which teachers. As I understand it, it's mainly about understanding which students should be accessible for viewing reports for various educators, and it does not mean that each teacher that's linked to a student under the roster files is necessarily instructionally responsible for those students. There's also some inconsistency in the way that these class roster files have been filled out in the past across the country, so there's that drawback. And then also it's not as detailed about student-teacher relationships as the SIRS data that we'll explore in a little bit. So the SIRS data has a lot going for it in terms of instructional responsibility weight, thinking about start and end dates of instruction. There's really a rich data set that we decided to use instead. That's the SIRS data, the Student Information Repository System data. That lets us know which courses students are taking that are aligned to math and reading. We look at the state course codes that are in the SIRS data. That lets us know which ones are math and reading. So for example, just for that first bullet point still, we look at the course codes there. If there's a 4-digit code, if it starts with 1 or 2, that lets us know that it's a math or reading course. If it's a 5-digit course code for the state course code, if the second digit is a 1 or a 2, that also lets us know that it's a math or reading course. So that's really where we determine, is there a course that really aligns to math or reading instruction? SIRS data is also our source for understanding which teachers are tied to those courses, the teacher's instructional responsibility, and it's also the way that we collect student demographic information and program participation. Programs meaning free reduced price lunch, those sort of things. There's a link there at the bottom. That would be where you'd go to learn more information about how SIRS data is collected in your district and how that goes to RICS in the state. Those are the data files that we also collect as part of our process. This is kind of a preview of some of the information we have in the frequently asked question on our website as well. A common question we have is, which students am I linked to as a teacher? So our team at EA receives your district student information repository system data to determine which teachers taught courses designated as math or reading or ELA based on the state course code. So here, this little visual, we see a course that was aligned to either math or reading at ELA, and the data file lets us know which teachers were tied to that course. It also lets us know which students were in that course and for how long. So as part of our process, we take into account, was a student there for the whole year or only half of the year, those sort of things. Lets us know how much should we hold each teacher responsible for the growth of each individual student. And again, just to hit home again, the NWEA class roster files are not used for our analysis. We use the SIRS data instead. If you're interested in learning more about how we use the SIRS data specifically, you can go on our website. The rules were established in collaboration with the New York Advisory Council, and you can find the specific rules in a downloadable handbook that we have on our website to learn more about that. So I know I talked at you for quite a while now. I'd like to pause now. You can type any questions you may have about the 3012C metric in the question box. I'll also pause for just a little bit. I'll take a drink of water. And if anybody wants to unmute themselves and talk about any questions you may have about 3012C, you can do so now. All right, I'll keep going, and I always like to do presentations with a New York audience because you don't complain too much when I go 90 miles an hour talking. But if anybody thinks I'm going too fast, please do let me know about that too in the question box too. So let's see. I have a question here. What is the sample size for the scores that we're producing? So in the past, we've been participating with about 40 to 50 districts, and it's been, I think, back of the envelope, and maybe Joe can refresh me, but something around 70,000 or 80,000 students?
Yep, about 70,000.
Okay, so that's what's been used in the past. We're still figuring out exactly who wants to use which metrics for the upcoming year. There may be some districts that have not used our services before that are interested in getting in for 3012D. That may expand, but in the past it's been about 70 or 80,000 kids, depending on how many districts have participated with us in the past. So I'm going to move on to 3012D now. The first thing I'm going to do is highlight some changes from 3012C to 3012D as it relates to the metrics that we're providing. First of all, now instead of the state approving a particular assessment and then that being the only thing the state is looking at, our understanding now is the state is approving combined approaches for the assessment and the growth metrics together. In this case, NWEA and Education Analytics, we've submitted a joint proposal, and that's been approved by the state for two different methodologies, one of which is a growth model, the other of which is a student learning objective approach. So those are the two things that have been approved by the state for 3012D. There's a new 0 to 20 APPR cut point range. We've looked at that, found out the regulations about that, and then our approach is tailored to make sense of those new translations to give you something that's useful for your district. So we've looked at that, we've taken that into account. And then the other new information here is that NWEA has gotten their language usage assessment on the approved list, where in the past it was just our metrics were about math and reading. Now we also are going to provide the language usage assessment results. So of these two methodologies, the growth model and the student learning objective approach, I'm going to start off talking about the growth model approach. First of all, I would just want to talk about the similarities of the 3012D approach to how it was similar to 3012C that we just talked about for about 15 minutes or so. So first of all, it uses SIRS data for rosters and course identification. That's the same. It also is going to have adjustments for student demographic characteristics. It's going to look at the average effect of educators on student growth. It's going to take into account the degree to which students grew faster or slower than peers, and I could go on and on. So a lot of what we just talked about for 3012C for value added is also how we have gotten our approach approved for 3012D. So a lot of that is very similar. The differences mainly are, number one, there's a new 0 to 20 translation based on the new requirements changed in the new regulations. We've tried our best to get at the spirit of what the Advisory Council has told us in the past for 3012C and applied new rules so that we get a similar distribution under 3012D. Also, the other main difference here is that the inclusion of the language usage assessment is something that's different. We are also going to be providing language usage results. So specifically that first change about 0 to 20, the scale range, some of you are probably well aware of this, but I just want to give you a visual depiction here. There is the 0 to 20 for the old 3012C up on the screen right now. This is the one that we talked to the advisory council about and figured out where we wanted to put the average teacher, what percentage of different teachers might fall into different ranges, those sort of things. The new 3012D scale has changed quite a bit, and the main difference here being is that the ineffective range has gone from 0 to 2 all the way to 0 to 12. So there's a huge range of numbers here that now translate to I in the Heidi score range. The developing and the effective categories have also shrunk down quite a bit for the scale. The highly effective range has remained the same at 18 to 20. So we looked at this new range and thought that we needed to naturally change the way that the way the translation scale has used in the past in order to be fair to teachers about what the ratings would be. When we talked about 3012C with the advisory council, we determined jointly that a good way to look at this would be to put the average teacher at the middle of the effective range. So in the old way that we used to do things and the continued 3012C option, what we found is that we should put the average teacher at the middle of E here. So that means the average teacher gets a 13 under 3012C using our methodology. We then decided that that would be a good thing to do again under 3012D to get the same spirit of what we decided during the advisory council meetings. So now the middle average teacher should get a 16 on our scale. So that's kind of our starting point for that. For anybody that's interested in Z-scores and specifically how we made that translation happen, we have the old translation on the left and the new translation to 3012D on the right. And that's something that you'll have access to if you want to look at this presentation later, if you're interested specifically in those cut points. But for anybody that's kind of visual like me, you want to see what the distribution is. On the left side, we have the histogram here that shows our bar chart of how many teachers approximately fell into different categories here during the old regime, 3012C. So last year, what we found out is the vast majority of teachers ended up in the effective category, about 85% of teachers. So that's what we had before. On the right side, what I'm about to show you is a draft of our new translation. And please don't get hung up too much on the exact percentages because this is still just a draft. But to get a sense of it, we try to keep things mostly the same in the way that we put our new translation to the state. So this has been approved by the state, and this is the way that the numbers have at least preliminary draft, I'll say draft, started to shake out here. So lots of teachers still in the effective category. This is using last year's data using the new rules. So basically, if you kind of squint at it, we've basically gotten something pretty similar. We'll still continue to refine this, and the specific percentages may change a little bit. So I'm going to pause now and ask for any questions that you may have about the growth model, specifically under 3012D. Next, we'll be talking about the SLO approach. So I'll pause again for any questions you may have. All right, if anybody's typing a question, please continue to do so, and I'll stop if I see any pop up as I transition to the SLO approach. But for now, I'll start talking about that. So people that have worked with us in the past, districts that have signed up, you're probably pretty familiar with how this new growth methodology might work under 3012D, but the SLO space is something really different. So I'm going to start by talking about key differences between the growth model approach and the SLO approach under 3012D. First of all, what does it compare to? So the growth model compares the growth of a student to the growth of similar students and accounts for things like starting point, demographic characteristics, those sort of things. In the SLO approach, we're going to be comparing the growth of a student to a predefined target. And in this case, it's going to be the NWEA growth norm. So we'll talk about that in a little bit in greater detail. What does it take into account? So the growth model takes into account the degree to which a student met or did not meet typical growth. So if you remember back to those arrows, it was, did the arrow, was it up or down, and was it a big arrow or a small arrow? It was about, did a student beat or meet the growth of similar students, and by how much? The degree mattered. In the SLO approach, it's just a yes or no. Did the student meet or not meet the target? Yes or no. The 0 to 20 APPR is based on, in the growth model, the average effect of the educator on academic growth, so it was about an average. In the SLO approach, it's mandated by the state that it's going to be a percentage of students that met the target. So we're talking about percentages in the SLO world. If you're visual like me, you might appreciate this. I did a little visual here to help you understand the difference in a different way too. So on the left side, we have the growth model. Here's a student. We got a predicted score for the student, apples to apples. So we took into account all those demographic characteristics of the student, the starting point, the test window, all that kind of stuff. Then we look at the actual score for the student, and we look, did the student exceed or did not meet, by how much? In the SLO approach, each student gets a target for himself or herself, and then we look at the actual score. Was it higher or lower? In this case, the student met. So in the SLO approach, it's a yes or no, met or not meet. Then to aggregate it up to find out a teacher effect, on the growth model, we look at, on average, did the students meet or not meet, and by how much? On the right side for SLO, we just count up how many students met. In this case, 62.5% of the students met their targets. So what's this target that we're talking about so far with SLOs? So our approved plan uses the national growth norms, and in addition to that, we also thought it would be a good idea to also think about the standard error of growth in consideration of whether a student met the target or did not meet the target. And I'll show you why in just a little bit here. So I've shown on the screen here, these percentage ranges are mandated by the state in the way that 3012D works. So for example, the state has declared that, let's see, for example, to get a 12, that means that 55% to 59% of students have met the growth target. That means that the state says that teacher is going to get a 12. So we looked at that and then kind of crunched our previous year's data to see what would happen. And it turns out that the average teacher using MAP tends to get about somewhere in the 50 to 60% range of their students end up meeting the national growth target. The state also described the target as a year of growth. So that's where we went in our heads first too, as well as the national growth norm might be a good way to think about what is a year of growth. However, as you'll see here, that would put the average teacher in the I category, in ineffective, which we didn't think would be a very good idea. So we also thought about how could we keep compliant with the letter of the law, but also kind of think about where we would want teachers to lie. So that would mean if we consider the standard error of growth when determining if each student met the target, that's a way to think about this a different way of a year of growth, but also kind of get a good policy outcome of what we had the advisory council telling us of what we thought an average teacher might be. We also went through the data and did the histogram thing again. So on the left side here, we have, what if we just used the growth norm and determined in the 3012D mandated cut points by the state, what would happen? So here you have about 80% of teachers would be rated I if we used the growth norms straight up. And we looked at that and thought that's probably not a very good idea. So with our adjustment for standard error, it turns out that we get something that's more in line with what we thought people would be expecting based on our advisory council meetings. In this case, the vast majority of teachers end up in either the H or the E categories of the Heidi scale. So in that case, that seemed to work out more with the policy implications that we had with folks in the past. So I'm going to pause now for any questions that you may have about 3012D's SLO option. And next we'll go on to logistics. All right, we've got a question about how is the standard error used? So there's actually a document that has been sent out that has some greater detail than I'll be able to go into just in the moment, but I'll give kind of the short version of this. And Joe, I'd also welcome your input in case I get anything wrong. So maybe I'll go for the visual here, back here a few slides. So the target would be for each student the growth norm, and then we look at the student's actual score and see when we think about the standard error, we look at 1.6 times the standard error. Yes. And determine if in that range did the student's actual outcome meet within 1.6 standard errors of the growth norm. Yes. So if that made sense or didn't make sense, let us know. Type into the question box again to see if that answered your question. I see another one. Does the SLO target approach take into account the student demographics like free and reduced price lunch? No, it does not do that. So that's one thing going for the growth model, is that does take into account things like free reduced price lunch status, the context of the student. The SLO approach does not do that. It just does the national norm for that student, which does take into account the starting point of the student, and then I think potentially also the weeks of instruction. Does EA calculate all the information for the SLO target model, and would you be able to adjust the targets of select students if they do? We're not going to be supporting that in the state approved model. What we'll be doing is each student's target is going to be that national growth norm, and then we'll be determining and sending back to you whether or not the students met those national growth norm targets, but also considering the standard error as was mentioned a little bit earlier. So it's not going to be something that's adjustable in the state approved models that we'll be providing back to you. So please do keep thinking questions and typing them in. I'm going to be talking about a little bit more for logistics here. So the first screen here, I'm going to be talking about how do we get to preliminary results. The first thing is there's going to be a sign-up phase. And if I understand correctly, there's going to be a survey that goes out from NWEA to partners so that you can go ahead and fill in the answers to a few questions that we're going to ask of you to let us know at our team at Education Analytics, what do you need from us in order to be compliant with the APPR plan that you're either negotiating or have determined in your district. So there'll be some options about, have you determined, are you in 3012C or 3012D yet, and those sort of things. For anybody that wants to use our services according to the survey, then we'll be reaching out to you. So there'll be two sources of data, one of which is the SIRS data. That would come either from the state, or we've typically been collecting with help from NWEA from the RICs, and in some cases districts. So that'll be the source of SIRS data. We'll also be collecting the MAP test scores and potentially CGI if you're on 3012C from NWEA. And then also we'll be reaching out to districts to fill out expected teachers templates. And for folks that have worked with us before, you're probably aware of what that is. I'll be talking about that in just a little bit to give you some more insight about what that is for anybody that's new to us. So those three things are going to go to Education Analytics. We will implement all the rules that we've gotten approved by the state. And then the results, the preliminary results will typically, in the past, been hosted in late July. Again, timeline is still pending, but those preliminary results would be hosted by us on a secure site for district review. So we'll give you those preliminary results, and then there'll be an embargo period Historically, that's been late July to early August. That's your chance to look at those preliminary results and then let us know, are there any gaps in coverage? Does anything need to be investigated by our team before final results are run? Does anything look funny? What's missing? So that we can make sure that we make any changes in order to incorporate those for our final results. So you'll give us those feedback elements, and then Education Analytics will provide results. Historically, those have been available in mid-August, and we do know that's pretty late in the season, particularly when there's some upcoming deadlines at the end of August about submitting those results to the state. The late mid-August has been the best that we've been able to do because of all these data collections from SIRS data and NWEA data going back and forth a little bit. Then we host those final results on a secure site, and we give those back to your district to disseminate internally and externally. I see a couple questions here. If a district chooses to use the SLO target model and wants to adjust targets of select students, like English languagers, free reduced lunch, would we be able to calculate the changes after you send us the results? So that's a good question. I think this might be something that we need to talk through in further detail to understand what you'd like to do and how we might be able to support that. So would you please email us at newarkappr@edanalytics.org. The email is going to be up on the last slide of the presentation. I think I'd like you to email us and we can go and talk in greater detail about what you'd like to do. I think this is a good kind of line of thought that we should follow up with you on. And the other question is, it's the timeline for both methods, for the growth model and the SLO. We'll be producing both of those methodologies on the same timeline, and the specific dates are not set in stone yet, but our intention is that for anybody on 3012D, we'd provide both of those models under the same timeline, so you'd get both at the same time. So expected teachers templates. This is that blue arrow from before about letting EA know which teachers should be getting results in your district. This is a way for us to make sure that we have quality control here, make sure that we get you everything that you need. EA is going to send diagnostic files along with the preliminary results so we can work together to track down any issues. Things like maybe there were some courses that were not designated as math or reading or language usage using the state course codes. That'll help us track that down. Maybe there's a missing teacher. Maybe there's a teacher who taught AIS courses and they're not being picked up by the state course codes. All those sort of things that are things that we could look at, especially rapidly if you give us the expected teachers templates ahead of time. That lets us diagnose those issues and then work with you to make sure there aren't any gaps. For timeline, those are typically things that we'd be sending out for completion in the spring. So that's something ahead of the summer that you get to work on and let us know which teachers you need results for, either for 3012C or 3012D. A little preview of results files. Typically these have been a spreadsheet format, and it would be one row per teacher. It'd have the number of students involved, the results, and a few other things that we chose not to put on the slide right here, but just to give you a sense of what you might receive from us. These would be delivered using EA Secure Portal. There'd be one file per result type, and there might be a few different results you'd be receiving from us. So you'd look at it and make sure you're using the right one. They'd be clearly labeled. And then these results would be distributed to educators and the state by you at the district. We do not give these out to the state. We do not distribute these to educators. We give those in the hands of the district representative that you designated. We would give those to that person through our secure site, and then that person would distribute those to the appropriate folks, internally and externally. And then what are the results? So for anybody that has used us for 312C in the past and would like to continue on, there's two different flavors. First of all, there's the standard result type. That would get you the teacher level results for any teacher that taught students in grades K through 10 in math and reading according to the SIRS state course codes. You would get value added results from us under the standard model. There's also a deluxe model. We created this one after some feedback from districts that wanted to use MAP in two different ways, or perhaps even at the grade level, team, or school level. In this case, you would get value added at the teacher level, grade level, and school level, and then also CGI, the conditional growth index. We would give those metrics. Under 3012D, what we have is we have teacher level results, we have grade level team results, and then school level results again. Language usage is a new thing that we'd be giving you. And for simplicity's sake, we are not creating different flavors of this. We're just saying if you need 3012D, we would give you all those different lenses for the growth model and SLO. So it would just be if you elect for 3012D, you would get all these things. A note here that CGI is not something that was approved for the state approved methods for 3012D. So that's something that if you were to need that, you'd need to go for 3012C with us again. So growth model and SLO are the new ones that are approved for 3012D. For timeline, the specific dates are still pending, but just for the sake of giving you a sense of it, I have up here the dates that were used last year. So these are not the ones that are going to be used this upcoming year. We'll be tweaking this a bit, but just to give you a sense of when these things might happen, here are last year's key dates. And the next thing I'm going to be doing is moving on to the question and answer session. So I'm going to have a few idea starters up there. Here, things that we discussed today, so you can take a look at those if that jogs your memory of any questions you might want to ask. That at the bottom there is our email address where you can address any questions to us about our APPR methodologies either under 3012C or 3012D. And then a note that there will be an upcoming survey about what your plans are for using MAP in APPR, if at all. So that survey will be going out to you. And let's see, I see another question here. Statistically, have you calculated how often an educator would receive a different HIDE rating using the different methods? So that's a great question. That's something that we are working on currently indeed. If your district has used us in the past, what we're even hoping to do is give you kind of a preview at the teacher level of what would happen if we use last year's data using the new methodologies to give you a sense of how things might change. We've also done it in aggregate. So this one in particular, we're going to make sure that we get this view to you as well. People have been really interested in seeing how things might change. What we have available so far are those histograms we displayed earlier, but we'll be thinking about what other aggregate and even if you worked with us before, specific teacher results might change using the different methods. So that's something that we're continuing to work on, and we'll share those additional information with you as we learn more. So I'm gonna stay on for a few more minutes in case anybody wants questions, and certainly we're here for. I talked fast enough to give you some time back, but also to allow for plenty of time here. So we've gotten through all the content I wanted to deliver today. So we'll stay on for questions, but I wanted to thank all of you for coming in and joining us with today. And I'll end up stopping the recording in case you want to do stay on with any other questions. But thanks for all joining us. I'll look at the question one, and then I can, of course, unmute anybody that wanted to ask anything verbally.